I'm on my own spiritual journey. I grew up in a high-demand religion, and I started to question the rules that were causing people harm. Reported it to church authorities and was encouraged to keep following the rules. My husband is up here in the first row up here wearing his egalitarian t-shirt. And help me get my slides up, thank you. And thank you to the IT people, thank you so much. My husband was also on his own personal spiritual journey and came across CBE International and reached out to the organization. Mimi responded and invited us to have a meal together, which we did, and from that day developed a friendship with she and her husband, Dale. My husband and I consider them to be a significant support for us during a very difficult time of transition. Over the months, I came across a book titled Created to Thrive on our book table in the living room. I figured CBE must have sent it, and my husband must have opened it and set it there. At the time, I had never read anything like it. This idea of holding one's religious organization, one's church congregation, one's community, one's family environment, one's workplace accountable to cultivating an abuse-free environment blew my mind. How could we do something like this? Especially if we as humans create hierarchies. How will the people at the top respond? And what if no one believes a class or a group like this is necessary? What if abuse in a faith community are never talked about or believed could exist? What if only women show up? When I'm working with a client, trauma is actually a pretty complex thing, but the roadmap to healing can be pretty simple. It's really just supporting this process of moving them to safety first. And then once the client feels safe and supported, amazing things start to happen. The client gets creative with ideas on how to heal. They get self-reflective. There's more pause, more spaces to explore, and life just kind of expands for them. So I knew for a class like this, we would need to spend a lot of time on the safety part. I contacted Mimi and asked her if I'd be okay if we could hold a Created to Thrive class at the new church congregation my family and I attended. And she responded with a resounding yes, and we went right to work. So far, we've held 2 of these classes. One was in 2023, and the other one we just finished in May. And each class we met 4 times. And each time we met was about an hour and a half. So if you can imagine this for your own congregation, or your own family, or your own workplace, doesn't matter what and we wanted this to be ongoing, an ongoing thing to hold our church accountable. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. If you get one thing from our time together right now, this part is the most important. We want everybody who comes and participates in this to feel fully resourced, to actually sit there and participate in something like this. And when I say fully resourced, what I mean is supported enough, strong enough, safe enough, welcomed enough, affirmed enough. So we advertised. The language is pretty important. We'd say something like, we know that so much abuse is happening as a result of hierarchies, theologies, religious ideologies, and the way that Scripture's interpreted. And we do not want that to be the way in this space. We don't even want to come close. We want to hold ourselves accountable to create an abuse-free environment in our homes and in our churches and in our communities, and we want it to be ongoing. So we started telling our social circles using that same language. Guess what we're doing at church after service? It's kind of like a Sunday school. After the main service, we all stayed. So guess what we're doing? We're holding a class that's actually holding our own selves accountable. The language we use can help us feel like a team humans who want to critique behaviors that cause harm. We included it in our newsletter, on social media, about 2 months prior to the actual class. And we made announcements at church every Sunday about 2 months before. We actually had a sermon just before the first class that really weaved this in to the sermon. And if possible, if you could have a man specifically invite the men to this class, or only women will show up probably. Let participants know before they attend the first class, so it's kind of in your announcements, these things. Bring a lunch, bring your comfort food. I brought tons of chocolate every single class and told them there'll be lots of chocolate there. We're attempting, and we want this class to feel very safe. Everyone's welcome. I was super affirming about attendance. Show up when you can. If you've got to leave early or come late, just come. If some people just wanted the handouts, fine. The reason I was so affirming about the attendance is because talking about abuse, talking about holding ourselves accountable is really hard. We're not practiced at holding ourselves and others accountable. We let them know you don't have to come and share anything. You can just come and observe. Just come and notice. Just come and listen. On the first day of class, we let them know that we can expect a lot of emotions. Many are going to come, and I hope you're thinking of your own congregations right now. Get creative. Many will come with their own abuse history, by a church leader, by their spouse, by their partner. A lot of people will be shocked that we're actually holding this class. This is a quote from one of the people who attended. I was shocked, in a good way, that this class was even being held. It may bring up memories of not only abuse, but times congregants left church feeling confused or belittled or patronized by the message. There may be people in attendance who've perpetrated sexual abuse on another. They may have sexually coerced another or wondered if they have and held that secret for a long time. We met in a small circle by the advice of the class. We started off not that way, but our congregation is maybe 80 years old and above. So kind of an older, not everybody, but there are some people in our congregation with hearing loss, and so that helped just to see mouths. It also feels inclusive, and people need to get up and move around during the class because it'll bring up a lot. We took breaks during the class, like we paused frequently. We taught some somatic calming techniques. We can do one right now. I just had, if you want, this is a havening technique. If you hold your shoulders crisscross like this and your feet grounded, both on the floor, and just sort of put some pressure down to your elbows, it'll give you a little bit of a zing and reset your nervous system. Pretty cool, huh? So just little things like that. Breathing is a really great one to use. just to help yourself calm. And then going back, gave them access to these books. This one, if you go in the bookstore, is, I think, right there. It's the first book on your left if you go in the bookstore right here. All right, next part of this, our time together, is the class content. What did we actually talk about? We went over the purpose again. Remember, we are helping to hold our church congregation accountable to be an abuse-free community, to develop a stronger sense of self, and develop the skills to self-reflect. We want this process of holding ourselves accountable to be and feel like an act of love. This isn't, I just reminded them it's not therapy. You know, sometimes when you get in a group like this and there's lots of trauma, religious trauma and things that have happened, we can over or under with trauma. We typically over or under, we're off balance. And so sometimes there can be oversharing in a group like this. And we want to send the message that everybody gets to be supported fully, everybody. And we may not be as a resource to support that person in that moment. And so we named that. We went through introductions. What do you wish to get out of this class? And guess what? A lot of the responses were, I just can't even believe we're holding this class like this at church. You mean there's a space for me to report things, to question things, to share something in a sermon that didn't feel so great to me? I felt confused. We asked them to notice what the class feels like in their body. Because a way to cope with trauma is to dissociate. And so we're wanting to reconnect. Kind of started off with a bang, naming statistics. And I also wanted to name that we probably likely have the issue right here in our congregation. 1 in 3 women will be abused by the time they're 18. This is only reported statistics, women who've reported. So I actually went, looked at the class participants and said 1, 2 abused, 1, 2 abused. And I numbered it because I wanted just to have some effect of like, this is likely in our congregation. And by the way, it's likely in this room right now. Numbers rise significantly with queer population, BIPOC, our people of color, disabled, and highest actually within BIPOC is our Indigenous women. 99%, can you just sit with this statistic? 99% of perpetrators of sexual violence are male. You can look at the US Department of Justice for those statistics. And they do vary a little bit, but they're pretty much always in the 90 percentile. A study by Ann Sutler, who studied sexual perpetrators, and again, her study came up with 94% of perpetrators of abuse are men, and 93% of those men identify as religious or very religious. I heard about that study from a presentation by Rachel Denhollander, US gymnastics teammate, one of the hundreds abused by Larry Nassar, if you remember her. And I was trying to find the number of men. I mean, we don't have this, I couldn't find this percentage, but I was curious. So we have 3 sons, you know, and is there a statistic that could say, son, you know what, by the time you're 18, you are 1 in 4 chance you're gonna become a perpetrator of sexual violence. I couldn't find that statistic. However, the US Department of Justice did find one that 1 in 4 men, by the time they're done with their college experience, will have sexually coerced somebody. Other reputable sources, World Health Organization, United Nations websites. How are these numbers possible? You don't get numbers like that unless we are supporting that as a community at large. Because when we don't support something, it doesn't stick around. Rachel Denhollander was asked, do perpetrators target churches, or does church ideology breed these perpetrators? And she was asked, what supports the system of abuse? She says, abuse of power or hierarchies, objectification, forced submission or oppression, and violence with impunity. And these ideas are all written about in Created to Thrive, that book. And because domestic abuse or intimate partner violence is a gendered issue, I actually told the class that I would be referring to women as the victims and men as the perpetrators because of the numbers. They're so significant. I passed out these two, the tactics used by abusers. You've seen, I'm sure, 1984 Domestic Abuse Intervention Product in Duluth, Minnesota. You can find these two easily online. This one on the right is in the book. I added the different degrees of power privilege, marginalization, and intersectionality. And this was adapted from James R. Vanderwoerd, Web of Oppression, and Sylvia Duckworth. That one's really important. The closer that you identify to that center of the circle, the more social power you hold. If you're way out on the outskirts of the circle, the less power, social power that you hold. We wondered about these things in the class. In your upbringing, did the institution of marriage, was it more important than victims? Were there any messages that women were failures without men? We just kind of thought about, wondered, got curious. Teachings about divorce. Does God want you to endure abuse? Is that more important than divorce? Was abuse a private matter? I think about your church congregation, or maybe it's not church. Maybe it's in your family. Maybe it's in your extended family. Is abuse a private matter? I mean, think about that. And why? Why was that the message? We read scriptures and verses in church about rape, murders, and we read that in the scriptures. And sometimes when it's presented, we don't say anything about it. We're not shocked, and that can create some dissonance. I didn't get to go to this workshop yesterday. Did anyone go to this one? Yeah, so I'll just do a brief. Catherine Bushnell, we also talked about her in the class. She worked in India. She learned firsthand the abuses of female prostitutes, learned it was justified by the British military, and realized that global abuse of women and the value of women as a whole are related. She wrote a book to show how Scripture values males and females, God's word to women. Joined others like Sojourner Truth, who used Scripture to support equality of people, women, and enslaved people. So thanks to her, by the end of the 1800s, we identified 3 different types of ideologies. So I'm sure this audience is very well aware. I wasn't until more recently. Patriarchal, egalitarian, and complementarian. The patriarchal and the complementarian having really strong negative social consequences. And higher abuse, not only with women So in those two, 1 in 3, higher abuse not only with women, but BIPOC, queer, kids, and women, because men create the caste system in patriarchal and complementarian systems. There is a lure, though. My husband and I grew up in a complementarian space, religion, and I think maybe many of you did. I don't know, this is my first time at this conference, so I'm just getting to know people, but I didn't even have a name for it. And when we were naming this stuff in the class, nobody really knew there was a name for that or what it was. So that complementarian, I just wanted to name, there is a lure. There is a slight lure to that way of looking at how God wants us to be. We talked about how there's often very violent words to the act of sex. We talked about how we talk about abusive relationships and how we say that instead of, no, he actually has really abusive behaviors that are causing that relationship a lot of harm and causing her a lot of harm. And so does that make sense? So saying that instead of that's an abusive relationship. It's actually not an abusive relationship. Someone in the relationship is being abusive, behaving in an abusive way. In the book, they talk about how we often will name the abused person in the relationship, not the abuser. So we want to name that abusive behavior. Also, using minimizing words like just and only can be really harmful. And this class is all about shining a spotlight right on behaviors. It's a real accountability process, and it's a beautiful thing, and remember, an act of love. You all know this, being here at this conference, patriarchal cultures side with men. Our focus in a patriarchal culture is to protect men at very high costs. That also conditions both men and women to disbelieve and distrust women. We also defined himpathy. Who's heard of that term? Himpathy? One person, yay. A term coined by philosopher Kate Mann, which refers to the disproportionate sympathy extended to a male perpetrator in cases of sexual assault, harassment, and other misogynistic behaviors. Himpathy. Let me give you another statistic. And this is also coming from the Department of Justice. They estimate out of 1,000, 310 rapes get reported, 50 of those lead to arrests, and 25 of those lead to incarceration. So about 2.5. Just anyone who's thinking, why don't women just report? In my own congregation, I work in the mental health field and saw a lot of people from my own, religious affiliation. And I was seeing so much abuse. I went to a church leader and reported it. And and it wasn't reportable in the civilly. It wasn't reportable to call the police or anything like that. And that leader quickly shifted his posture to wanting to protect me and take care of me, and offered to give me a blessing and pray for me and to anyway, the point of me being there was very much pushed aside, and I didn't even realize it until a couple of months had gone by, what had happened. We talked about communities not always having the education that we do today. Obviously, we're all learning. In the 1980s, if a couple ended up in court because of domestic violence, their couples therapy was mandated in this country. And we know now that if there's domestic violence within a partnership, that can actually, couples therapy can actually make that worse. But we're learning. Another example we talked about for abuse to grow and perpetuate is that all perpetrators need is for the rest of the community to do nothing. We think omissive behavior is kind of nice sometimes, but it actually causes a lot of harm. Do you remember watching movies when you were younger in a crowd and something really patriarchal, misogynistic would come on the movie and everybody in the room just kept watching and nobody ever talked about it? I remember times like this, and so that's another example of just not saying anything can cause harm. Because when you have impressionable minds in the room, you're looking to how your elders will respond. And if it's nothing, then you think that's the way we need to address patriarchy and misogynistic behaviors, is just do nothing and don't talk about it. In our home, we stop movies all the time. Our kids get probably kind of bugged with it. We're like, notice this part, notice this part. Reading scripture verses at church that demean women, and this can get really confusing, is when we omit context in the scriptures and we're not explaining the story or offering a message of hope or egalitarianism from the scriptures. You've ever had that experience? We talked about gaslighting. How about that one? Has anyone heard of that? Gaslighting. Okay, more people. Gaslighting's a covert type of abuse that will manipulate someone using psychological methods into questioning their own sanity or powers of reasoning. And just speaking from a therapist's point of view, it's a really difficult thing to pick up on. It takes skill to pick up on that kind of manipulative communication. We talked about the acronym DARVO. That's coined by Jennifer Freyd, a psychological researcher and professor at the University of Oregon. In her 1997 article, Violations of Power, Adaptive Blindness, and Betrayal Trauma Theory, DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. And it's a defense mechanism used by manipulators to avoid accountability when confronted with their actions. DARVO's a combination of gaslighting and blame shifting. In the church that I grew up to, we were taught and told quite a bit to follow our inner spirit or inner voice. But if that ever was different than a leader, you were wrong. Gaslighting, maybe? perpetrators have really manipulative communication styles, and it's actually it's a way to survive their own trauma. And I wanted to give this example. When I saw the Rachel Denhollander speak, she brought up, I'm not quoting her exactly, but I'll try and summarize what she said. She actually did talk to her parents about the abuse that she suspected happening, and she and her parents confronted Larry Nassar. So I just want you to point out that she did all these right things, and he was so good at what he did that he responded with, you know what, Rachel, this is so good that you came to me. It's so good that you're here with your parents. This is exactly what you should do if that was abuse. Thank goodness it wasn't. And that's skilled, manipulative behavior. Four-dog defense, if any of you have heard of that, explains delay tactics when industry wants to keep a product on the market, but this is also what women deal with. Tell me if this feels familiar. Number one, that's not my dog. Number two, if it was my dog, he didn't bite you. If my dog did bite you, it didn't hurt you. My dog bit you because you provoked him. Victims want to speak up, but we have to get back. But victims who want to speak up have to get past a lot of obstacles. Speaking up before a victim has all the evidence, not believable. Speaking up before you can remember every detail, you're dumb. Speaking up with every detail seems fishy. Speaking up after years have gone by, why'd you wait? Speaking up about a man in a position of power, that poor man. Speaking up if you land on the perimeter of the power and privilege wheel, who is she? I just finished the book One Way Back by Christine Blasey Ford. If you remember, she's the one who testified of abuse perpetrated by Brett Kavanaugh, who currently serves on the U.S. Supreme Court. I'd highly recommend it just to see what women or victims of abuse need to endure if they speak up. This book right here, I didn't see it in the bookstore, but I'm sure CBE has lots of these too, but it's called Nurturing Women's Equality, and it's full, the whole thing is just full of accountability questions. So we took time at the end of each of the classes, and we asked ourselves some of these accountability questions. And, they didn't have to answer. We could just think about it. Some of them will or won't apply to your congregation, but here's a few examples of what's in that book. Consider the way art, drama, readings, images, and music are chosen for service and events. Who chose them? Were or are underrepresented groups asked for input in choosing those things? When you have an all-church event, who works in the kitchen? Who cleans up? Who works behind the scenes and who stands up front? Just think about it. What answers do you give congregants for tough texts about male headship and female submission or women speaking in church? And do you feel confident with your answers? Are you kind of getting this process of holding ourselves accountable? We want to become abuse-free spaces forever. And you have to keep holding our own selves accountable. So the last part of this, you're hanging in there? It's hot, isn't it? Okay, I'm almost done. What does accountability look like moving forward? Our church congregation has not exactly defined this yet, and I think it'll be an evolving thing. And also, I think we're in a crowd of really smart people here. And when you start thinking about how could we do this in our congregation, and maybe you don't start there, maybe you start in your own partnership, maybe you start in your own home, whoever lives there, or anywhere that feels safe to start. But here are some things to think about, okay? So when you're sort of forming, what would that even look like? This space that's ongoing that we can hold ourselves accountable to being abuse-free. Keep using language that supports inclusivity. Keep using language that implies everyone is on the same page around wanting an abuse-free community, now and forever in the future. Keep using language around holding ourselves accountable as an act of love. Create this ongoing intentional space to critique behaviors and come up with new ideas for change. How many brave souls have spoken up and said, I think this behavior is actually causing people harm. And I have another idea. People were killed for that. We don't want that. We want safe spaces where people can come and have other ideas about behavior that could be better and not cause so much harm. In my experience in this system of patriarchy, the problem is not a lack of those people. I think you all are probably those people who have had good ideas and have said, you know what, I think this behavior might be causing some harm. In my experience, it's the people in power's inability to be critiqued. Here are some other things that could be discussed. Developing skills to separate our behaviors that perpetrate harm and our identity. That's one of the reasons it's so difficult for some people to be critiqued, because we've put them so high on these pedestals of hierarchy. They don't know what to do with that. It's not a practiced thing. And so the critique that I did something wrong sort of becomes their identity. So we want to separate that, because in reality, we all cause harm. We all are causing other people harm. And a lot of times we don't know we're doing it. We don't want to. So separating that, it's crucial, and I believe especially for men. Think about if you were asked in this crowd right now, if you were asked to raise your hand and say, I was sexually abused when I was 18 years old, and share it with the crowd, versus if I had asked you to raise your hand and say, I sexually perpetrated on someone when I was 18. Do you feel which one brings up more shame and might be more difficult to verbalize and talk about? So it's really important part of the class to name a really unhealthy system that produces really unhealthy behaviors. That way we can all feel on this team. We're all over here looking at this patriarchal system that creates really unhealthy behaviors. So see that feel? We're all on the same team. I'm just going to explain this arrow. If on the green side, your relationship feels 100% certain abuse-free. There's no abuse. It feels very relational, full of love. On the red side is when you are 100% sure abuse is happening. There's no question. Where would you want, say, if you were talking to your child about abuse or a young person, where would you want them to come and report something? Hopefully you're not thinking the red side. Think of these little kids. Where do you want them to report something? Yes, right when the green is barely turning to the yellow, right? So we talked about this in the class. The thing that's the hiccup here is that our culture doesn't support that. And that's what this class is for. We're breaking that. We're doing something really different here. Really different. So this ongoing thing of holding ourselves accountable is that green barely turning yellow. I'll give you an example. We, in the new congregation that we go to, there's a time in the Sunday session that is past the peace where people go around and say hello. One person in our congregation felt like it was appropriate and fine to hug everybody. And we got some complaints. It didn't feel right. People wanted more permission or felt like they wanted to know that person better before engaging in a hug. And so it got brought up, right? If we have stuff ongoing classes like this, people start feeling really safe to bring things like this up. Do I think this person was wanting to cause harm? I am 99.99% sure no. I'm pretty positive that this person had a lot of good experiences with hug. And so I don't think that this person was intending to do any harm, but this person was. And so I'm not going to tell you what our church came up with, our resolve, because I want you to just think about that. These little things where it's green just barely turning yellow when your nervous system is like, something feels just a little bit off. Just a little bit. I didn't really like that. What do I do with that? And we want a community that supports that. So, let's see. We could also bring up a sermon. Maybe there was a story of abuse in the scriptures where a congregant was confused or it felt like the interpretation of the story wasn't helpful. And isn't the goal for everyone, especially victims of abuse, to leave church feeling hopeful? We can keep going over those accountability questions. There's so many accountability questions in that book. So you could just meet and go over some more of those. Maybe somebody noticed, you know what, at our youth activity, I noticed there wasn't too deep leadership. So do you see this sort of things we can bring up barely when the green turns to yellow? So I hope this gives you some prompts for what an ongoing accountability space looks like for you and your community. Survivors of abuse and perpetrators of abuse are watching to see how the community responds to abuse. So let's be super clear and explicit about what our abuse-free intentions are. And with that, we'll leave the rest of the time for questions if anyone has any. And if you need to get up and just kind of stretch, it's hot in here. And yeah, yes. Yeah, the question is, what do we do when there's resistance? And I think you're not alone. I think there's people shaking their heads like, wow, what, I don't know if I could bring something like this up. So I might put you on the spot a little bit. My husband is just an amazing person. He's such awesome feminist and just right here with me. We just feel like this team, but he's been super instrumental. I think he's the man who invited the men. And I think it takes men to invite men. So you're going to have to find the men who are more open and to something like this. Talk about what you're needing. And I mean, you can look around. These men in our midst right here are likely those men. And then have them ask the men who are more resistant. So, yeah.